right. Hello, and welcome back to a joint venture between Real Seekers and Reason to Doubt. I'm Dale, the Real Seeker, and I'm joined by Jordan from Reason to Doubt there. How's it going there, Jordan?
It's going great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah. This was basically, I wanted to do this show because I saw a show that you did that I actually really liked, where you were kind of tier listing or evaluating all the various arguments for God and Christianity and stuff like that. And one of them was there was a small segment on Bible prophecies. And, you kind of mentioned that you don't think it's a good argument at all and that sort of thing. So I wanted to say, well, I think there is some hope for it, but I have kind of a unique take with Messianic prophecies. So that was the impetus for this show. I wanted to see what's your take on my nuanced argument, and can it succeed, or is it a lost cause, just like the typical argument kind of thing. So yeah, but just before we get into today's debate on Messianic prophecies, I just want to turn it over to you. What's new with Reason to Doubt? What do you guys have coming up in the future?
So Reason to Doubt, for anybody who doesn't know, is a channel I run with a friend of mine named Jared, and we're both atheists, but mainly the channel is about skepticism, right? And so we cover any topic that touches skepticism. Lately, we've been doing a lot of stuff in the Shroud of Turin, so we have recently done our episode on the radiation theories around the dating of the Shroud of Turin. So I think we've got at least one more episode in our carbon dating series there. But I'm also working on scripts for the Salem hypothesis or effect, which basically is why engineers are just the worst people ever and fall for conspiracy theories all the time. And some other stuff like that. I think we got some interviews coming up. So, yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So engineers are back with the Salem witch trials. That you guys are.
It has no touch with the Salem witch trials. The guy who noticed it is his name was Salem. So that's all. Yeah, that's like that. Now it's basically like if you go on like Reddit boards or something, and there's someone who is claiming to have scientific credentials, and is arguing for creationism, they are likely an engineer. And why?
Interesting. Okay. So that's pretty cool. I'll definitely check that out. But for today, we're talking about Messianic prophecies, and the plan for today is I'll give kind of a quick 10-minute or so opening, just giving my case of my argument. Then I'll let Jordan give kind of a quick response as to what he thinks on it, and then we'll go into a discussion. So that said, let me bring up my slides. Okay. Boom. All right. Hopefully, is that showing up? Jordan?
Yep. All good.
All right. So the Great Messianic Prophecies debate. Okay. So by way of introduction, when it comes to the evidence from Messianic prophecies, I think that there are fundamentally two different approaches to establish that, these things are supernatural or miraculous in nature. So the first is kind of the traditional argument that Jordan was responding to in his video with Jared, the argument from direct fulfilled prophecy, right? So this is where you have a burden of proof that requires you to prove that, well, look, there is a prophecy was given in advance of the fulfillment, and that the prophecy is of such a nature that the fulfillment would be deemed to be extraordinary in some way. And then you also have to prove that each of those elements was indeed fulfilled after the fact. So you have to prove the prophecy, plus you have to prove the actual fulfillment happened. And obviously that can get kind of difficult. So, for example, with Isaiah 53, a famous Messianic prophecy that we'll be looking at today, part of the prophecy is that not just that Jesus died. I'm sure Jordan will agree. He's not a mythicist wacko, so I'm sure he'll agree that we can prove Jesus died historically. But can you prove that he died for your sins? How would you prove a theological thing? You can't prove that. And because of that, stuff like that, I don't think making a traditional argument from fulfilled prophecy can work with respect to the Messianic prophecies. And that's why I adopt a different, or I've tried to develop a different or more nuanced argument based on the extraordinary circumstances. So it's a circumstantial argument. Essentially, I call it the Jesus or bust argument. So this is my own nuanced version, whereby I use the same messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, or some of them, and I argue that these prophecies, number one, they were written before the events take place, and again, they're of a sufficiently remarkable or extraordinary nature. So we're not just prophesying that the Messiah will be a human being. Oh wow, who cares? That of course, yeah, something like that. But when it comes to, I don't have to prove the fulfillment actually took place in history. I'm more interested in the can I prove that there was an unfalsified claim to fulfill that those messianic prophecies? So it's on the basis that only Jesus makes unfalsified claims to fulfill these messianic prophecies. Nobody else makes unfalsified claims to fulfill these, or can make an unfalsified claim to fulfill these, and that's unique. And based on that, I think that's an extraordinary circumstance. It's either Jesus or the messianic prophecies, throw them in the garbage. It's a bunch, they're unfulfilled nonsense kind of thing. So that's kind of my argument in a nutshell. That's where it's different. Now, what are some of the potential skeptical defeaters for my argument as I see them? And Jordan, he'll give his case as to what he thinks they are. So I see it that there's 5 potential skeptical defeaters. So there's strategy 1, which you just refute my positive messianic prophecies case, right? So today we're going to be looking at specifically 3 messianic prophecies. So Jordan might come back and say, hey, those don't really predict what you say they are. Or they do, but it's not really remarkable in any way. I mean, you're just predicting the Messiah would be a human being. Who cares? Or something like that. Like, that's not anything that would really differentiate anyone. Strategy 2, again, refuting the 3 specific messianic prophecies I'll be using, but proving that Jesus, or Jesus as per the New Testament, does not make an unfalsified claim to have fulfilled those, right? So you either prove, well, look, there is no claim. Jesus doesn't even claim to have fulfilled them, or he does claim to have fulfilled them, but we can historically falsify that and prove that Jesus didn't fulfill them. That's strategy number 2. Strategy 3 is that, well, outside of the 3 messianic prophecies you've selected, Dale, you're committing a selection bias, because I can point to other messianic prophecies whereby Jesus didn't fulfill these. We can prove he failed to fulfill these. And therefore, all things considered, he's not the Messiah. We don't have Jesus or bust. We just have the situation that it's a bust type deal. Strategy 4, Jordan could provide proof that there's another messianic candidate. So pointing to Bar Kokhba and say, well, look, we have these provable messianic prophecies that are extraordinary, and Bar Kokhba makes unfalsified claims to have fulfilled these. And guess what? We get this situation where it's Bar Kokhba or bust. Or likewise with that, Jordan could say, well, I'll just take the 3 messianic prophecies you use, and it's actually not the case that it's Jesus or bust. We can have Jesus Bar Kokhba or bust, or Jesus Caiaphas or bust, or even as many Jews today, rabbinic Jews today, they try to say, well, look, we have Jesus, a future unknown Messiah, or bust, kind of thing. So that's the 4th strategy. And then the 5th strategy is granting everything I say about the Jewish Messiah, but then saying, but this circumstance is not unique, because I can point to another religion or another thing. In Hinduism, we have a similar situation, or in Buddhism, I can present a case that it's Buddha or bust using Buddhist prophecies or something like that. So these are the 5 ways that I think someone can defeat my argument here. Okay, so with that said, let me get into my case simpliciter. So I'm looking at 3 messianic prophecies. So the first one is from Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, and it's known as the New Covenant Messianic prophecy. It says that one of the things that the Jewish Messiah does is he will bring about a new spiritual covenant to fulfill the Torah, or the law of Moses, the old covenant. So it says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand and bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts." And so basically, this is saying there would be a new covenant, and it would be spiritualized. It would be less outward focusing and more inward focusing, where the purpose of the law would be fulfilled, and it would be within their hearts. So does Jesus claim to fulfill this? Obviously, the Christian Jesus claimed to fulfill Jeremiah's new covenant. And this is actually explicitly said in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13, where it states in that he says, "A new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now that which is being made obsolete and growing old is near to vanishing away." So there's an actual explicit claim. Beyond that, there are many implicit claims. I mean, Jesus gives certain parables talking about the new and the old, such as his parable of the new wine, representing the new covenant, as recorded in Matthew 9:17. And by golly, I mean, look, we have the New Testament. Another word for that, testament, is the new covenant. So even inspired books are representing this new covenant. So I think it's clear that Jesus claimed to fulfill these. There's no way that I know of for Jordan to falsify these claims. No one's proved that Jesus didn't bring in a new covenant. I think it's pretty clear from the origin of Christianity itself that there was something pretty darn new, whereby the old covenant didn't apply to the earliest Christians. Circumcision no longer applied and stuff like that. Kosher laws didn't have to follow that anymore. Okay. So I guess, I don't know, okay, so very quickly, one objection that Jews will give to this is they'll say, well, look, we admit Jeremiah 31 is indeed a messianic prophecy. You got that right from the context. There's no doubt this is talking about the Messiah, but it's not talking about a literal new covenant where the old covenant's made obsolete or is fulfilled. No, it's a reaffirmation of the old covenant. It's a reestablishing of the old covenant, just like King Josiah did. Yeah, King Josiah, back in the Torah, they forgot the old Torah, and they had to reestablish it when King Josiah discovered it in the palace. So that's how the Jews kind of counter this. What's my response to this? No, again, this is clear. The prophecy says that the new covenant is not like the old covenant that he made with their fathers. And it even goes on to spell out the differences in that the new covenant will be spiritualized, and that the new covenant will be related specifically to the Passover meal as well as the Messiah's sacrificial death, right? And that's where Jesus comes in and says, look, this is the blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. We also know that the new covenant is supposed to be a better covenant. That's in context, right? So the rabbi is saying, well, it's just reaffirming the old covenant. No, that's not reaffirming the old covenant isn't better than the old covenant. That's just going back to what we had before. The new covenant needs to be better in context. And there's also a sense, this is the context of Jeremiah 31 is also talking about the priesthood. Well, guess what? Jesus is said to be our ultimate high priest, our Kohen. He is the intermediary between us and God. That's what the Christian claims about his sacrificial death on the cross. So it all fits. Okay. Next up, we have Isaiah 53. Everybody knows about this, right? This basically prophesies Jesus' death and his resurrection from the dead. And this is by far the clearest messianic prophecy. So here are the elements where it explicitly mentions Jesus's death, or the suffering servant's death. He would be led like a lamb to the slaughter. He was cut off from the land of the living. They made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death. When you make his soul an offering for sin, because he poured out his soul unto death. All of these are explicitly mentioned. His death is also, his resurrection is implicitly mentioned through two texts in Isaiah 53. When you make his soul an offering for sin, that's not, so he's dead, but that's not the end of him, because then he goes on to see his seed, and he shall prolong his days. How can you prolong your days after you're dead? He was resurrected 3 days later, or the prophecy saying he would be resurrected, and that's how he prolongs his days. And secondly, he shall see the labor of his soul, the fruits of his ministry, and be satisfied by his knowledge. My righteous servant shall justify many. Well, that's exactly what Jesus claimed to do. He gave his ministry, and he was led like a lamb to the slaughter. John compares him to the Passover lamb. He was killed on the cross, and Christians claim that was for our sins. He justified many. He was, didn't defend himself against the wicked. He even made his grave with the wicked, because he was crucified by the two criminals. And Joseph, the rich, Joseph of Arimathea, buried him in his tomb. These are just the claims that the New Testament Jesus makes for Jesus. And those can't be falsified, I would argue. So, yeah, Jesus has claimed fulfillment. Now, here's a thing that I think Jordan will go for, because Jordan has responded on his channel that, you silly Christians, look, this is not a prophecy about the Messiah at all. Strategy one here, you guys just aren't reading this chapter properly. It's talking about the nation of Israel. And this is what all modern rabbinic Jews try to claim. But are they right? Well, I have 5 rebuttals to this. So, number one, zero, bubkis, nada. No authoritative Jewish sources interpreted this text as referring to the nation of Israel until Rashi in the 11th century. 1,000 years go by, and no one are the Jews just incompetent? They don't know how to read their own scriptures for 1,000 years? None of them. In fact, the only one who even hints at it is a heretical Christian church father, Origen. But none of the authoritative Jews give this interpretation. And in fact, a lot of them, such as in the Talmud and Targums, give a messianic interpretation to this chapter here, prophecy here. So some ancient Jewish sources refer to this text as a messianic prophecy about the Jewish Messiah. The servant is depicted as righteous, yet lowly and afflicted, despised and rejected. Now, the nation of Israel has never been totally righteous, with literally having, quote unquote, no deceit in its mouth at any time in its history. And in fact, if it is talking about the nation of Israel, this actually violates God's covenant with Israel in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, for example, whereby it says, look, as a nation, when Israel is obeying God, is righteous or obeying God, he will bless it, and he'll only curse it with suffering and affliction when they are disobedient. Right? That's why Jews with the Babylonian exile, for example, that was their punishment. That was their curse. God was cursing Israel as a nation because they were being sinful. But the suffering servant, he's not being blessed when he's innocent. He's being cursed when he's innocent. And that's the opposite of what God does for the nation of Israel. The suffering servant can't be the nation. The servant, after his suffering, was said to be highly exalted, so that kings and leaders, Gentiles, pagans, around the world would stand in awe of him and bow down to him. Well, the nation of Israel has never really been highly exalted to the point that Gentile kings and leaders have bowed down to them and been in awe of it. Really, it's been the opposite. I mean, with persecution throughout the millennia, the last couple of millennia of the Jewish people and stuff like that. Fifthly, and finally, Israel's suffering at the hands of the Gentiles have only ever brought further condemnation on themselves. So when God was finished using them to punish the Jews for their sins, Israel's sufferings have never biblically or historically brought healing or redemption to these pagan nations that are persecuting Israel, right? So after God used Assyria or Babylon to punish Israel, well, then God in turn punished Assyria and Babylon, and they didn't bring about redemption and forgiveness. It brought about their condemnation by God in the Bible. So those are my 5 reasons that rule out the nation of Israel as an interpretation for this prophecy. Lastly, we have regarding the timing of the Messiah, right? Because so far, Jordan can grant basically everything I've said, right? In terms of the Messiah must bring about a new covenant, and he would die and rise from the dead. And gosh darn it, Jesus fits that description. Jordan can grant that to me in this debate, and I would still lose because he can say, well, maybe there is no other Jew in history up to today who's fulfilled that, but maybe 50 years from now, there will be another Jewish Messiah. So it won't be Jesus or bust. It'll be Jesus, future unknown Messiah or bust. Well, here's why Daniel chapter 9 is key, because it tells us the specific timing for the Messiah. And it predicts that the Messiah would have to appear minimally and die before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Any other messianic candidate after the year 70 AD is falsified by this prophecy. They cannot be the Jewish Messiah. So what does it say? So 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So, right. So Daniel's living during the Babylonian exile, just for context, right? So the Jews have been, the first temple has been destroyed, and the Temple of Solomon, and they've been exiled to Babylon. And they've been living there for about 70 years. And Daniel's wondering why, like you said, we would only be in exile for 70 years, and then you would restore Jerusalem. So he's asking God, what's going on? Why hasn't this come to pass? And God sends the angel Gabriel to respond and to answer that question. But then the angel Gabriel goes further and provides this messianic prophecy. So this is what they're talking about, the restoring and rebuilding of Jerusalem and the Second Temple. So it's saying until the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So that's a total of 69 weeks. And by weeks, that just means weeks of years. These are sabbatical year cycles. So it's basically talking about a period of 483 years, or that's 69 weeks of years. And then it says it will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks is completed, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And this is a Hebrewism for saying he will be killed and have nothing. He will be out of the land, cut off from the land of the living. And the people of the prince who is to come will then destroy the city and the sanctuary. So the Messiah, basically this Messiah is saying that, okay, after 483 years, the Messiah will come and he will be killed. After the Messiah is killed, the city and the sanctuary will be destroyed. So this is where we get the proof that the Messiah must come before the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, there are many things to debate here, such as what the weeks of years. As I said, I take the interpretation that these are literal years. Most biblical scholars go for that. And it's referring to sabbatical year cycles, which is a period of 7 years, right? 1 week equals 7 years. These are not, some Christians try to use nonsense things like 360-day prophetic years and stuff like that. These are just not viable according to most biblical scholars. That's how I would interpret that. We also have to say, well, when is the start of this 7 weeks or this 490 years? When does this start? And we're told it's at the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Well, there are different candidates for when they would start. We can go over those just to save time. I won't. I think the best one is in 457 BC, which was the decree of Artaxerxes, which focused on rebuilding the temple. But Ezra was given permission to use those funds to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And in the ancient Near East, the rebuilding of the walls represented the city as a whole. That was, in fact, the most important part of the city for obvious reasons, for defense purposes, and that sort of thing. So that's where I would say the start is. And guess what? If you take 483 years away from that, we come out to 27 AD, just the precise year that Jesus started his ministry. He was baptized by John the Baptist, so Jesus makes a fulfillment claim. He was killed 3 years after that, 27 AD, in 30 AD, when he was killed on the cross, and that's not falsified historically. And we know 40 years after Jesus was killed, the second temple was destroyed in 70 AD. What about the specific things that the Messiah is said to do? Does Jesus make unfalsified claims? Well, to fill up the transgression. Well, again, Jesus' death on the cross is said to satisfy the people's transgressions or sins against God, right? This is known as the satisfaction theory in atonement theories of the crucifixion. To seal up the sin. Again, Jesus was the perfect sacrifice for sin, offered to forgive mankind's sins once and for all upon repentance. So the sin problem was decisively sealed, and death was defeated on that day when Jesus died. And this is in Hebrews chapter 10. To make atonement for iniquity. This is, again, it's obvious, right? It's kind of saying the same thing, but we are able to be redeemed, or we can be atoned at one-ment with God and reconciled to him through what Jesus did on that cross, his death and resurrection. And again, these are explicitly stated in the New Testament text. To bring in everlasting righteousness. Well, what happened is God ushered in the Messianic era, right? That some Christians don't go for this. There are some differences, dispensationalism and that sort of thing, but there are, at least I would claim, unfalsified claims by the New Testament and Christians that what Jesus did on the cross and his resurrection ushered in what's called the Messianic era. So we have this already but not yet aspect of the kingdom of God. And that part is universally agreed to by all Christians, this already but not yet, the kingdom of God. Jesus ushered in the Messianic era through his death and resurrection. People were at one-ment with God or reconciled to God, and that kingdom of God is continuously through the centuries growing until Jesus returns at his second coming. To seal up vision and prophecy. So, once again, all these prophecies Jesus fulfilled, and he claimed to complete all of the Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiah. And there was no need for new divine revelations after Jesus and his immediate followers instituted the Christian church. And then finally, to anoint the most holy. This is the most difficult one to understand. Well, what is the claim? How did Jesus fulfill this? There are various ways. I think it's kind of talking about the initiation of the spiritual temple, which again is clearly in the New Testament, right? We as Christians now are the temple of the Holy Spirit and have Jesus dwelling in our heart. And in that way, Jesus anointed the most holy. If you don't like that interpretation, you could say, well, again, Jesus anointed it because he was God's anointed, the Messiah and the high priest. And when he entered the temple complex, right before he was killed and stuff like that, that's another way Jesus could have claimed to anoint the most holy. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to get to those objections. So yeah, summary of my case, because I've been talking too long. So just with these three prophecies alone, I think we can clearly establish that there is this circumstance of Jesus or bust. The Messiah is said to usher in a new covenant. Well, Jesus claimed to usher in a new covenant, and that's been you can't really falsify that, especially because it's a theological claim. He definitely historically he did bring in a New Testament, a new covenant, uh, the religion of Christianity versus rabbinic Judaism or traditional Judaism. The Messiah would die and rise from the dead to atone for sins. Once again, Christianity claims that about Jesus. Jesus claimed to die on the cross for our sins, and 3 days later he rose from the dead. And then finally, the timing. The Messiah would be killed before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Gosh darn it, Jesus was killed in 30 AD. And this happened before the Second Temple was destroyed 40 years later. So it's all check marks for Jesus. And I would submit that there is no other Jewish candidate, Messianic candidate, that you can point to who even makes unfalsified claims to have fulfilled just these three elements. So it's unique. We have Jesus or bust. So that's my opening case in a nutshell there. Hopefully it wasn't too boring, but yeah, over to you, Jordan, to kind of give your case.
Just a couple clarifying questions
Sure.
for myself and the audience. So the point, the purpose, the goal of this argument, as I understand it, is not to say necessarily that Jesus did in fact fulfill these prophecies, but that the combination of the prophecies are such that if Jesus didn't fulfill them, then nobody ever can. Is that right?
It's that yeah, Jesus alone is the only one that makes unfalsified claims to fulfill through the New Testament and biblical Christianity's claims.
Okay, so if successful, someone would be convinced that the only possible options for a Jewish Messiah would be Jesus or never, like
Yeah,
nobody ever.
yeah,
Okay,
Jesus or it's a crock of garbage. But
gotcha.
yeah,
Okay. First, I am in fact not a mythicist wacko. I do think that Jesus existed in history. Um,
good. Sorry.
I am currently an atheist. I used to be a Christian. So I mean, if I wanted to be unentertaining, I'd just say, "Cool, bust then." Like, Jesus or bust, I choose bust. Like, that's a perfectly valid option for me, but that's not very entertaining, so we'll keep going. I do think that, while this version of the argument might, avoid some of the burden of evidence that the more traditional version does, it still has some of the same elements, so you'd have to show that the prophecies were made in advance, otherwise they're not very good prophecies, right? And you'd have to show that the combination of things coming together would be extraordinary. So usually it's like, here's the prophecy. If someone will fulfill this prophecy, it would have to be extraordinary, because you're trying to loop in all of them and kind of constrain Jesus in such a way that he's the only option. It would still need to be that the combination of things would lead to just one singular person, and there'd be no other way for it to for it to obtain any other way. And I'm not sure that the nature of prophecy in the Bible is such that that's going to be possible. Prophecy by its nature is slippery, it's flexible, and it's interpreted in a variety of ways by different people. In other places, you've said, and other people said, there's no like label on a verse in the Bible that says, exclamation points, by the way, what follows is messianic prophecy, and then prophecy, and it says, okay, end prophecy, and keeps going. Like, that's just not how it does it. So people have to read through the text and decide, this is a messianic prophecy, this isn't. That by its nature means that if you can kind of build your own adventure. If Jesus didn't fulfill this, well, guess what? That wasn't a messianic prophecy, no problem. Or if Jesus did seem to fulfill something, boom, we'll pick that out. That's a messianic prophecy, and we know it because the Messiah fulfilled it, right? You've also got slippery stuff inside prophecies because there's multiple ways of interpreting them. And so you can just pick the one that fits the person that you think. And I'm not saying that you do that dishonestly. Like, I don't think that the the original Christians who were doing this, digging through the text, and the original Christians were Jews by and large, digging through their text, trying to find pointers to Jesus. I don't think that they were doing this to deceive. I think that they believed Jesus was the Messiah. And so they'd read Isaiah 53. It's like, wow, golly, that sounds a lot like Jesus, boom, fulfilled prophecy. And so I think in order to actually succeed, you would need to show that your combination of things is not just that it applies to Jesus, but that there's no other interpretation that you could have that would make it such that you could apply it to anybody else. I think that is a thing that you'd have to take on as part of your combination argument. So yeah, that's my stance. And now we can just talk about the specific points if you want.
Sure. Okay. So that's your opening. So yeah, thank you. Yeah. So I think the first thing I would just say, the first point that I heard you raise, I had to run out for a second to grab a piece of paper, so I might have missed your second point. But the first point is you were kind of like, well, Jesus or bust. Cool, I'll go for the bust option, right? So very clever, but I don't think I think that's kind of missing the point, right? Because let me ask you this: when you said bust, then are you trying to say that you can prove that the bust option is true, or are you saying what? Okay.
I'm just saying that, so if you were making this argument to somebody who accepted that someone must eventually fulfill the requirements of Messiah, like that's a religious commitment they have, then this could be efficacious. I'm saying that for me as an atheist, even if you manage to show that it's either going to be Jesus or no one will ever fulfill them, okay, then I guess nobody's, I can just as easily say, okay, nobody then. It's fine. I don't ever need anyone to fulfill them, whatever. But I think at that point, at least your argument still be succeeding, even if it wouldn't convince me that Jesus is the Messiah. It would be, your argument would be conceding at the thing it is setting out to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the thing it's setting out to do is not convert me personally to Christianity. It's to convince me of this particular proposition.
Okay, cool. And so that is a valid thing to do if we're trying to adjudicate, well, let's pick one. But I think my argument, here's what I want to get. So let's pretend, Grant, we have this circumstance, Jesus or bust, just for the sake of argument here. And if I could get you to that, I'm trying to argue, and that is significant in proving that, well, it's not bust then. It's got to be Jesus, because that circumstance is unique under atheism or naturalism, right? If we assume there's nothing special about this circumstance, why, if it's so easy to make unfalsified claims of this nature, why on God's green earth has no one else been able to do this? Why did Bar Kokhba suck? I mean, if you look at his claims, they're not fulfilling anything about the Messianic prophecy. And in fact, the only Messianic prophecies he was claimed to fulfill, in the end, he got killed and the Jews got slaughtered, so he's been falsified. So don't you think that the fact that only Jesus could have pulled this feat off, isn't there something to that might suggest there's something going on? Because under naturalism, I would expect this to be a dime a dozen, like some other Jew could do the same thing.
I think that there's a little bit of the puddle analogy sort of thing going on, where, or more like you throw a dart at the wall and then draw the target around the dart. I think that's kind of what is happening with the foundations of Christianity. So to dig in, I think it might be illustrated if I dig into one of the examples. So one of the examples you gave was let's go with the timing one. So the timing of the Messiah, it has to be at this specific time, right? Mm-hmm. It's 70 weeks, and weeks are years because they're prophetic weeks. And from the outside, it's like, okay, well, they're prophetic weeks, unless they're like literal weeks, or unless they're decades, right? Because where's this rule written down? You can't go out and measure a prophetic year. It's just whatever people have declared that they would be. Some people, like you said, well, they're 360 days. You don't agree with them, but who's to say they're wrong? Well, it means it doesn't apply to Jesus, but okay. There's no external validity to any of these things. And you can see this in practice in people using these similar rules to predict the end of the world, which has been a pastime of Christianity for 2,000 years and still going strong. If you remember in 1984, the 84 reasons why the world thereafter is going to happen in 1984, the gentleman who wrote that used this kind of prophetic language, this kind of prophetic math, and had a whole bunch of reasons why that all pointed to 1984. But we're still here, so obviously it didn't happen. And my point is that because of the nature of this kind of prophecy, it's flexible enough to be made to apply, perhaps not to anybody, but to a wide variety of people in a wide variety of situations. And when you add on to that it's not unambiguous what even counts as a prophecy, which ones are prophecies. Well, if person A says he doesn't fulfill this prophecy, you always have the option to say, well, that's not actually a prophecy, and so you can kind of build your own adventure to get to Jesus. And so I'm not sure that you can get to the point with this kind of material that you could ever say unambiguously and clearly only Jesus could have ever done this, because the conditions that Jesus is intended to fulfill could easily be argued to be otherwise.
Okay, so I take your point. Those were second and third, and I was going to address those. But just before I move on from your first point, for the sake of argument, let's say those are not issues, because I think I can prove the elements I've chosen here. I can prove those objectively are the correct interpretation. It does apply to the Messiah. They are, in fact, Messianic prophecies. For the sake of argument, if I've done that, and we arrive at this circumstance of Jesus or bust, would you then think there's something to it?
Well, it would depend on what the circumstances were. So like you mentioned, for example, if you could make a prophecy where the Messiah would be human, like, okay, cool. Or like a prophecy where the Messiah would be born of a young woman. Okay, there's like 4 in my local high school, so like if it's a combination of things like that, then no. But like if hypothetically you could show this list, no more no less, are the Messianic prophecies, this combination is extremely unlikely to have happened for anyone. Like it's not something you would have expected any human alive to have fulfilled, and then this guy fulfilled it. That might be an indication, depending on how unlikely it was, that there's something going on.
Okay. So I think with the 3 that I've given, right? So he would usher in this new covenant. He would die and rise from the dead, which is, not going to happen naturally, or very, very improbable to happen. And this would all happen before 70 AD. Would that combination would qualify as kind of, that's not just predicting he'll be human.
I mean, those are unusual things. I mean, I know there's a lot more of things that you predict, and we're not covering all of them for the sake of time. So, like, if you got to the point where the combination of things were such that no person in history, if you were to run history, you would expect to get 0 hits. Then the fact that you got 1 hit may indicate something significant. Maybe not. I mean, probability works weirdly sometimes, but.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. All right, so let's move on then, because obviously the key is are these interpretational issues and stuff like that, right? So, and that's why I was very careful when I was selecting things that would be uncontroversial. Like, so I focused in on elements that even rabbis would, for the most part, agree with and stuff like that. And I've provided certain reasons, right? So with the new covenant, Jeremiah 31, just to start with that one, even modern day rabbinical Jews, everyone, it's uncontroversial that this is in fact a messianic prophecy. There's going to be debate as to how we interpret it, but we at least go, yeah, this is about the Messiah. Do you think that's an objective element, or do you have doubt that that's a messianic prophecy?
I don't care to argue it. Sure.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Okay. And in terms of bringing in a new covenant, then, so this is where Jews and Christians would disagree with each other. They would say, well, by new covenant, Christians say it's a fulfillment, right? It's literally something new, right? So, for example, you don't have to get circumcised. Gentiles don't have to follow the kosher laws. There are clear differences. And rabbinic Jews will say, no, it's just a reestablishment of it. I think I gave reasons as to, hang on, let me share my screen just to help remind you, so here's one, there we go. So I tried to give reasons as to why my interpretation is objectively correct, and that people who interpret it otherwise, they're just objectively wrong, at least on a balance of probabilities, right? So, um, is this not it? Yeah. So for example, it explicitly says in the prophecy, and this there's no translation issue here, that the new covenant will not be like the old covenant that he made with their fathers at the time of the Exodus with Moses. Um, I think it's pretty clear, even just from that alone, just from what the text says, that this is a different covenant. Um, don't you think that's a good reason?
Well, who decided that it was a new covenant? That was primarily the people who came after Jesus died, his followers, who wrote these books and declared this is a new covenant. It was Paul who came up with the idea, probably, that, or at least popularized it, that Gentiles don't have to follow kosher laws. In fact, this was a schism in the early church where the more Jewish followers of Jesus, including some people who were like probably knew Jesus personally, thought you still had to be Jewish. And if you were going to convert to Christianity, you had to follow the law. You had to get circumcised. And Paul was like, no, because people are not going to do it if we have to cut off parts of their penis. So let's go do this thing. And so, like, clearly it's not unambiguous because the earliest Christians argued that like there was a major schism. Now, the one that was more popular went out. But this isn't necessarily something Jesus did. This is something that his later followers put on Jesus, or you could at least interpret it that way. And so, again, if you're relying on writings written by people who came after Jesus died, and these people who are writing the writings know the prophecies, right? And so,
Mhm.
if the Messiah has to make a new covenant, well, by golly gee, Jesus is going to make a new covenant, and here's what that looks like.
So that's great. So on the prophecy end, on the back end, right, in terms of the prophecy itself, I think you're agreeing with me that objectively, yeah, the prophecy does seem to be calling for an actual new covenant, but your objection is more about, well, did Jesus make an unfalsified claim to fulfill that? And you're saying no, that's been falsified because later writers just invented something like the no circumcision, stuff like that. Um, is
Not
that
ex-
is that
Not
correct?
exactly. So, I'm not saying that it's been falsified or arguing like, let's say that this is a prophecy that he's going to make a new covenant. What does it mean to make a new covenant? What does that exactly look like? How would it manifest? I can imagine many different ways in which one could argue you have a new covenant. Jesus, the way that Christianity did it, you could say is one of those ways, but it's not the only way in which you could have a new covenant. Um, Jesus certainly didn't lay it out unambiguously, and the only words of Jesus we have come to us written by people who knew of these prophecies. And so you always, whenever, even if you could say, and I don't think you can, but even if you could say, this is what a new covenant will look like, A, B, C, and D, right?
Mhm.
And then in the gospel, you have Jesus saying, I've done A. Well, did Jesus say that? Or did the people writing it who have the prophecies in one hand, did they put those words on Jesus? Or, and I'm not saying they're lying, because I don't think the gospel writers were being deceptive, but this is how legends form. If someone has to be A in order for them to fulfill the thing you think they fulfilled, then it's very natural for stories to crop up where he's doing A. Like, and so you just got so many things you'd have to actually establish, right?
Well, so I don't. So here's the beauty. I don't think I do because I'm not making a traditional argument from fulfilled prophecy. So if you're conceding that there are these claims about Jesus in the New Testament, and that's all I care about, right? And you're saying you can't falsify that Jesus said this. So that means we have this claim that Jesus supported this or said this, right? Like certainly Jesus didn't give a rat's patoot. Well, this is the wrong way to say it, but he violated the Sabbath from a strict Pharisaic perspective, right? So I could point to that as an example and stuff like that. Um, and the Paul and other New Testament writers are claiming that Jesus ushered in this new covenant, which included these aspects about Gentiles don't have to be circumcised, and the kosher laws, you don't have to follow that. So the only way I think your objection would work is if you can, on independent grounds, historically prove that Jesus didn't claim this, or didn't support this this particular aspect of the new covenant. And since you're saying you wouldn't make that claim that you can falsify it, then we're just left with, great, well, we have an unfalsified claim, and that's all I need for my argument. Does that make sense?
So if you're trying to argue that Jesus is unique in this, that Jesus' situation, that not just that Jesus is unique in the history we have so far, but Jesus will forever be unique in this, right? Then this combination of things need to be such that nobody else could do it. Well, yep. Literally anybody could say that they made a new covenant if their later followers declare that they did, because there's no one unique specific way in which a new covenant has to manifest. It just has to be new. And so, like, whatever new means, the later followers of whoever this future Jesus Jewish Messiah would be could just declare this. No, that Christian one, that wasn't actually new covenant. This one, this is the real deal. This is the new covenant, right? And so, like, even it doesn't matter whether Jesus did it or not, whether even Jesus said it or not, because you don't need it to be just Jesus did it. You need to be Jesus did it, and nobody else ever can. And I don't think that this is the kind of thing that nobody else can ever do.
Fair enough. So, okay, so I have two last responses on this thing. So the first thing is I would say, well, no, be careful, because remember, it's not just that anybody can do this. It has to be somebody before 70 AD, given Daniel chapter 9. Right? So it's not just anyone in the future. So, and just conveniently, amazingly almost, we don't have any Jew living before 70 AD other than Jesus, where there's even a claim that they brought in a new covenant in any sense of the word. I mean, look at the Maccabees. They were said to be anointed ones and stuff like that, and they just reaffirmed the old covenant and brought it back against Hellenism. So there's literally no Jew before 70 AD who even makes this, as you put it, great, such an easy claim. I mean, look, I'm Dale, and I'm bringing in the new covenant of Daleism. It's so easy. The second thing I just want to give as a rejoinder, and then I'll give you the last word, and then I'll move on. But it's also not true that this new covenant is just completely unqualified, because in Jeremiah it does specify certain things about it. So, for example, it would be better than the old covenant in the sense it would be spiritualized in the day of the Messiah, where the law would be written and commandments of God would be written in the hearts of the followers of God, right? So that's something that had to be in the claim of anybody that claims to bring in this new covenant. And it also had to be related to the Passover meal in context and a sacrificial death in the place of the Jewish people or other people for their sins. So those are specific elements in Jeremiah that also need to be a part of any claim to bring in this new covenant. So last word to you on this.
I personally find it distasteful to say that the Christian version of the Christian redaction of the Old Testament, the laws there, is better than the Jewish version. I don't know that there's an objective way to say it's better. You can think it's better for you personally. Other people may disagree. So I don't know. Better doesn't seem to be a very valuable modifier here. But in any case, what it being spiritual and written on your hearts, like, that could again mean almost anything, as long as it's different. You could say that, okay, what's written on your hearts is this set of laws. Like, what's written on my heart is that you have to be circumcised. Boom. Now I have a spiritual law that's different from the one Jesus allegedly did, and it still fulfills the requirements. And in terms of the timing, I don't think that these are objective things. I know you think that your interpretation is correct and other people's interpretations is wrong. However, even within your interpretation, you're picking this start for the nation of Israel versus this other start, which could be argued, or you're taking this version of what a year means versus this other version of what a year means. And I'm not even arguing that you're wrong in that that's the correct interpretation or whatever. I don't think there is a way to say who is right aside from your answer gets you to Jesus. And if someone else's answer got them to Jesus, that would be the one that's right, because
Gotcha.
Jesus is the Messiah,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I probably see the last word, but I'm just gonna say something because I'm gonna agree with you on something that you said. So in the first place, one thing in terms of better, that's Jeremiah who's saying this. So the prophet is making this qualitative assessment, but I agree with you. Even granting the spiritualization of this new covenant, well, even that itself is still kind of vague. What exactly does that mean? It's still not specified. So I agree with your point there that there are multiple ways that could be fulfilled. Yeah, it just so happens the only way we know of, the only one who's ever made a claim is Jesus that I can think of. So all right.
Real quick before we move on, just to get, since I got some people in the chat who had a question to get the audience in. It's a question for you.
Yep.
Nitty says Clement, Hippolytus, and Irenaeus all gave completely different dates of fulfillment. What does that tell you?
Okay, so let's go to Daniel 9 then. So because you raised that and about the dates. So okay, so one thing you mentioned is that there are multiple points for this to start, right? So we know what's relatively uncontroversial, I'd say, is that there is a period of 490 years. And again, rabbinic Jews, Rabbi Tovia Singer, the most anti-Christian, anti-missionary in the world, also agrees with this. And it's just the way the language is. I can't pronounce the Hebrew, but Shabueh, Shabuim, something like that. But this 70 weeks of years it is 490 years. Where I'm bringing in an interpretation is that I think those 490 years are literal years, and I can back that up. And so there's not a 360-day thing that only biased Christians who want to get it to fit Jesus are the ones who say that. So no other scholars admit to that. But in terms of the starting date, I don't think this really matters because I can take whatever. There are only 5 options, okay, that the Word of God allows for the starting date. So these options here are exhaustive, right? So you on the farthest end, you can have what is the word to rebuild and restore Jerusalem from the Babylonian exile? Well, some Jews will say, well, that was before the city was even destroyed. That was Jeremiah receiving the 70-year prophecy that Jerusalem would be destroyed by Babylon for 70 years and the people would be taken into exile, but then the city would be restored. So you can either say at the earliest, it's 605 BC for the start of this Daniel 9 prophecy, okay? And if you fill out, do the math and stuff like that, we end up in the Maccabean period or something like that. Okay, great. Well, that's still before the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And yeah, the Messiah, Jesus, if it's Jesus, he was killed after the Maccabean revolt, a couple hundred years afterwards. So it could still work there. Now, if we do the commission of Artaxerxes, this is the latest, so 446 BC, then we end up at 38 AD. So this is the only one that creates a problem for Christians, and that's why they invent, it's 360 days or something like this. But here's why I would favor that. I would say this can be ruled out as the only problematic thing objectively. So number one, this is not a royal edict. The Commission of Artaxerxes, it doesn't mention rebuilding the city as a whole. And because it's not an official royal edict, it's simply a restatement of the previous one. So here, the one in 457, the one that I'm favoring, is an official edict. And again, it does speak of the city's walls being repaired with the funds being needed. And walls in the ancient Near Eastern are represent the city as a whole. That's not controversial. Um, so yeah, basically, what I would say is the way I'm using Daniel 9 for the prophecy about the Messiah specifically works for all four of these options, with the exception of this one. And this one can be objectively ruled out. So does that answer Nitty's question?
I think that Niddy is saying that the mere fact that the patriarchs all give different dates and come to a different way shows that it's not specific. But I think I'm not even sure that I'm convinced that this has to be before 70 AD, because there's always this inbuilt flexibility in these prophecies. You can always appeal to the spiritual realm or to prophetic non-literal language. And so, for example, if it has to be the rebuilding of the city walls of Jerusalem, well, Jerusalem still exists. So you can always rebuild those walls if that's the marker you had to have. And in terms of timing, it has to be, you mentioned liberation from Babylon. Well, Babylon can be taken metaphorically to be liberation from some other conquering thing. And so this is a metaphorical Babylon. And so my point is not that these things are the interpretation to have. My point is that one could point to the exact same verses and have a completely different interpretation. And I'm not sure that there is a way to go out and measure this with, there's no independent measurement one can take to definitively say their interpretation is wrong.
Definitively, yeah. I think that's true. Sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so because it's so slippery, it could always apply. You can always reinterpret it a different way. And so I'm not again, I think that's this endeavor of trying to constrain Jesus is a clever thing, because then you don't have to show that he actually did it, right? And so that's a huge relief, right? That you don't, all you have to show is that someone claimed that he rose from the dead. You don't have to show he claimed from the dead. I mean, that's that just like orders of magnitude helps your case, right? But yeah. Still, I just, the nature of prophecy is such that it's not really amenable to being locked down like this.
Okay, so
no, and just to Niddy said yes, that what I stated was basically what he stated. So
okay, so the thing is, I would say, like, that the metaphorical Babylon that works for something like Revelation, but it doesn't, as though it but it doesn't work in the context of Daniel 9. Like, we objectively, I haven't heard any scholar, like even the most radical scholar, who would advance that as even a possibility, because in the context of what's being said, it is clearly Daniel was, according to the author, written during the literal Babylonian exile, right? That's what the story is purporting. Whether that's true or not, who cares? But that's what the author is trying to get us to believe, is that Daniel's writing at the end of the Babylonian exile, and then he gives this prophecy about 490 years from the decree of their overlords, of the exilic leaders, which were the Persians at this point, to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah. So that the context is just clear that it is talking about the literal decree to rebuild and restore Jerusalem. And I literally know of zero scholars who question that.
No, so nobody questions it in the version of history we have now, right? Up to today. But that's not the point. It's because you're not saying that this is the only person who did do this thing. You are also saying he is the only person who could have ever done this thing, right? This sort of claim not only has been made for Jesus, but cannot be made for anyone else. And so it's just not sufficient that this assertion hasn't been made yet. It needs to be such that it can't ever be made. Otherwise, this unique set of circumstances wouldn't apply uniquely to Jesus forever and all time. And so if one could interpret this prophecy in a different, more spiritual way and still have some grasp on legitimacy, then that just means that in a different version of history, if you replayed it differently, some other person could claim in a different time, in a different place, in different circumstances, could claim to have fulfilled this prophecy. That's not the world we live in. And, so maybe this, but I'm saying, like, in a different version of history, somebody else could do things differently than Jesus and still fulfill this prophecy. Or somebody else in the version of history we have could fulfill this prophecy in the future in a more spiritual way. That's what I mean.
Okay. So I guess I would just have to appeal that those suggestions are falsified, are extremely likely to have been falsified, given the context of this prophecy, whereby objectively it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt. Let me at least say that this prophecy itself is meaning a literal decree and talking about the literal city and a literal Messiah being killed before the destruction of the second temple that's rebuilt. I think that.
Okay, so let's go to a different prophecy that you've mentioned, not here but elsewhere, to kind of show what I mean about this flexibility.
Okay, well, just before we do that, because I was going to give you a point, right? Here's where there's it's not proven beyond all reasonable doubt, and I kind of. So what is the Messiah going to do before he's cut off? And there's certain things here, right, about finishing the transgression, an end to sin. So some of these are I think are very clear as to what they're trying to say, but there's more debate as to what it means. Like, so for example, to bring in everlasting righteousness, or this one right here is the most controversial, to anoint the most holy. What exactly is the prophet saying here? There is ambiguity here, and that's where I think your point that you're going to come to would more apply. But even still, because I'm only caring about established Jesus, either way, whatever this means, we don't know the proper interpretation, right? So because we have this unknown, we can't use this against Jesus, and Jesus definitely has an unfalsified claim that may fulfill this. Because of that, I think that you can't point to this ambiguity and say, well, the argument fails. We just have to ignore the ambiguity until we figure out exactly what it means, right? If we could prove that to anoint the most holy, let's say that can only be interpreted with a spiritual Messiah and a spiritual Babylon or something like that, well, then you could argue, well, Jesus can't fulfill those. He's been falsified. But you can't say, well, we don't know what this means, therefore the literal interpretation of Jesus's claims can't be used or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can just ignore the ambiguity, but I would say that there's a lot more. There's so much potential ambiguity that I don't think you can ignore it. But what I mean, with you're talking about the person who wrote it meant a literal reconstruction from Babylon, and so we should go with that, right?
Yeah.
Elsewhere, you've talked about the virgin birth as something that points to Jesus, and obviously there are scholars who say this doesn't mean a virgin birth; it means the birth of a young woman. And that's what the person meant. He was talking about a specific young woman in his own context. But the argument that this is like, actually, that's not, no, it's not this virgin or this young woman here. It's a virgin in the future. And whether or not he was talking about a young woman or a virgin or now or then is a little bit beside the point. My point here, just like with the spiritual thing here, even if the person seems to be talking about someone in his own time, you can always interpret it to mean something different. And so it can be whatever you need it to be in order to have your person fulfill this thing. So it's not that even Jesus didn't fulfill this prophecy. It's that Jesus is not uniquely positioned to fulfill this prophecy. Does that make sense?
Okay, so maybe say it again, because I thought I was getting it for a second, and then I lost it. Sorry.
Okay, fair enough. So you're saying that the 70 AD, the spiritual Babylon thing, that hypothetical idea that I threw out there, wouldn't work because the person writing the book, whether or not timing doesn't matter, he was talking about the actual exile to a actual literal Babylon and the rebuilding of the walls from that literal exile.
Right.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't And I can concede all of that, because it's not enough that the person was saying that. It's what I'm pointing is somebody else in a different set of circumstances could just as easily interpret it differently, and there would be no way to say that they're definitively certainly wrong. And as an example of this happening, um, in Isaiah, there's the prophecy that a virgin or young woman, depending on how you want to interpret the language, would give birth, right? That would be the sign. And scholars, many scholars at least, say that he's talking about that right, a person in his time.
Right.
This a person right now is going to do it. That's going to be the sign. Christians interpret this to be predicting a future person. Whoever's right. The point is that it can be mean in his own time when you need it to be in his own time, but it can also be a more spiritual or future looking thing when you need that. And which one's right? There's no one to say. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. So I would agree with you. Look, I'm near 100%, but I don't think I would want to claim that, for example, with Daniel 9, that, oh yeah, no, it's 100% absolutely proven that the guy who wrote this prophecy didn't have in mind a spiritual Babylon and a spiritual rebuilding of Jerusalem or something like that. That didn't correspond to the literal rebuilding and restoring of Jerusalem in a decree. But that's why I would say, objectively speaking, we don't need absolute certainty. I'm just following a balance of probabilities. And with this particular example, the evidence is so strong, that I would say it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt. It's more than 95% certain that that is what this prophecy is saying. But in order for my argument to work, the point is, I don't need to have absolute certainty that my reading of the prophecy is correct. So long as I can prove on a balance of probabilities as to what the prophecy is and as to what Jesus' claims are, and that it's not falsified. Obviously, the more probabilities involved, you've got to put that together and stuff, right? But once you put all those elements together, if the total is it's 51% or more proven that, yeah, the prophecy said objectively this would happen, and that Jesus has an unfalsified claim to have fulfilled those, and only Jesus has that unfalsified claim, then that's enough for my argument to succeed. I would say, well, probably these messianic prophecies are miraculous. So it doesn't need to be 100%. I don't know why you're so appealing to a possibility. Let's say there's a 1% possibility that your spiritual interpretation, I'm kind of just like, well, who cares? I follow the evidence.
So, first of all, I agree. If something is 50.1% likely, then we should believe it, just not very strongly. But
Going to decimals, geez, you beat me.
but in any case, so it's more that I'm not appealing to a possibility and saying it's possible, therefore it's probable. That's not the kind of argument I'm trying to make. I'm trying to say that I don't think you can put you can analyze it with any kind of certainty, because they're equally just as valid interpretations in the context of the way that prophecies are interpreted. But I did have one more point that is I'm just basically kind of trying to outline why I think prophecies don't lend themselves to this kind of analysis. And another example is the related to the virgin birth, which I understand isn't a prophecy brought up today, but it is a very popular prophecy, right? And so this one comes from Isaiah 7 and is it's very iconic in Matthew 1, right? And so in Matthew 1, for those who haven't memorized the entire Bible, it says that Matthew 1:22 says, "All this took place to fulfill what has been spoken by the Lord through the prophet." Verse 23, "Look, the virgin shall become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God with us. And then it goes on a little bit. Jesus woke from sleep, blah, 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 blah. He had no marital relations with her until she gave birth to a son, and he named him Jesus, not Emmanuel. Now, there are interpretations of the prophecy that get around that, but my point is not that there aren't interpretations, but the prophecy said be born of a virgin and named Emmanuel. And he is at best born of a virgin and named not Emmanuel. And so you're kind of taking the parts of the prophecy literally that you want, and the parts that you don't want to be literal, they're not literal. And so like you could just like, if somebody else had been born, done all the things Jesus did, except his name was Emmanuel, he'd fulfilled it even better, right? So
Gotcha. Yeah, that is a great point, right? So yeah, so it's with the obviously I'll talk about the virgin birth kind of thing, right? So there's a difference. So one thing I'll say to start off with is that so with the virgin birth, right? Some Christians say, yeah, Isaiah is actually predicting a virgin birth, and I would say based on Isaiah being written in 750 BC, we can't know. It's an equally probable interpretation that maybe he's predicting that there'll be a miraculous birth and that's a virgin birth, or he's just predicting that there'll be a young woman will have a miraculous birth and that will be Emmanuel and stuff like that. So my first point is that if we do have an equal probability where there's ambiguity, that can't be used against the success of my argument, because the fact is, either way, Jesus has an unfalsified claim to fulfill that. Now, the second point that you raise, which I think is a good point, is that you're saying, no, we can actually falsify Jesus because his name was Jesus, and the prophecy clearly says that the little baby's name would be Emmanuel, right? So now you're kind of providing look, I can falsify Jesus on a balance of probabilities on the basis of this aspect. And that would be a good argument. And obviously this is where I would come and say, well, I don't think you can prove that the prophecy is saying his literal name would be Emmanuel. I would argue, again, names in the ancient Near East, especially in this early time, pre-exilic period, we know how the names functioned, right? They often function as titles or aspects or attributes of something, right? And that's why so many names have God's name in them, stuff like that. So Emmanuel, I think it's an equally probable interpretation. And if you think I'm wrong, you can tell me why. But I think it's equally probable to say that this is talking about the attribute that Jesus would either be literally God with us, or more likely, because I don't think Isaiah knew about the incarnation, that his birth would signify God is with Israel and is reconciled with Israel, despite this King Ahaz's stupidity. So I think that's an equally probable interpretation of that aspect of the prophecy compared to yours of saying, well, the baby had to be literally named Emmanuel.
So I think, trying to think the best way to say in words the graphical picture I have in my mind. So you've got, your whole argument is basically you're restraining the attributes that a Messiah must have, right? So like if you have one prophecy, maybe it has multiple interpretations, and so it could be this group of people, and then another prophecy has this group of people, and if you overlap all of them together, it narrows down to just one point, one person, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so my what I'm saying is, because prophecies are innately so flexible, I don't think you can with one interpretation narrow down to this point, but you could just have another interpretation that narrows down to another point, and another interpretation that narrows down to another point, and so the probabilities are just going to explode because they are so like almost infinitely fungible. Like you can they're like Gumby. You can manipulate them any way you want, and so like there's a little bit of confirmation going on, because like the earliest Christians, when they were looking through their text trying to find confirmation, they picked out the verses that matched what they believed. They believed Jesus was the Messiah. Here's a prophecy, let's match it to Jesus, and just going on and on and on. Again, not deceptively. I'm not asserting that they were lying or it was some conspiracy. This is just how humans work, and so the idea, because your argument hinges that nobody ever could fulfill these prophecies, only Jesus can.
Mm-hmm.
it's not just enough to say, well, I think the probable interpretation is this. No, it has to be, this is the only interpretation that is reasonable, because otherwise some other person in the future could do it, or some other person in the past could do it. Like it.
Fair enough. So that's, I think, strategy, what I called strategy 4 as a defeater, right? So you're absolutely right. So let's pretend you say there are these other equally probable explanations for these messianic prophecies and stuff like that. Great. If it's equally probable, then you can falsify my argument, because yes, maybe I get the circumstance of Jesus or bust given my interpretations of Isaiah 7:14 and stuff like that. But because I've admitted there are equally probable other alternative explanations of these prophecies, you can put those together, and you can also construct Jared McComb or bust, right? His last name's McComb, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. I got it. I'm learning. So you can also do that, and that would falsify my argument. Here's my simple response. The problem is you can't do that. Nobody's been able to. Can you point to one example where you give these equally probable explanations of Daniel 9 with the spiritual thing and whatever the alternatives are? In Isaiah 7:14, it's a literal Emmanuel and stuff. Who is this other candidate before 70 AD that fulfills this alternate cumulative case?
Well, I don't concede it has to be before 70 AD, but leaving that aside,
Okay.
I think that requiring that someone actually did it is a little bit of a catch-22, because the oxygen for someone to have done that has been already eaten up. That we have no idea how many people may or may not have claimed to have done any subset or all of these things or more of these things in the first century, because we don't have an exhaustive record of every religious claim made in the first century. What we do have is the one guy who was successful, right? And so nobody else can come and do this same shtick, because there's already a religion for that. If you're going to make a new religion, you need to be at least somewhat different from the old one. And so it's just not likely that someone will become popular enough to be a major player in this scheme, because Jesus has already claimed that spot on the board. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So two points. I will agree fully with you that if you're saying, I don't think this is provably true, but for the sake of argument, if there's an equally probable explanation of Daniel 9 or any prophecy, messianic prophecies to do with the timing that can include a future one, then yeah, you win. You can just say future unknown Messiah does that, and you've defeated my argument. So that would depend on me, and I think I can meet this burden of proof, and I've done so with Daniel 9, but there's also Haggai chapter 2 and Malachi as well that I could use. But so long as I can prove that it has to be before 70 AD, then you can't appeal to that. Now, your second point is okay, let's assume that I can prove this, so it has to be prior to 70 AD. And you're saying, well, the subset, we don't know who's made. Maybe some random guy made a bunch of claims to do all these interpretations and stuff like that. So on that front, I think for our purposes in the show today, given the prophecies that I presented, maybe there's an unknown guy who claimed to die and rise from the son of a gun, die and rise from the dead, and to have brought in a new covenant, and he lived in 100 BC or something like that. So if there is, that would defeat my argument. But that's where I would apply to other messianic prophecies, perhaps something like the Messiah must be a light to the Gentiles, meaning that his claims have to be known throughout the world. And on that front, I could falsify these anonymous people that are just unknown to history, perhaps. So, but yeah, that would be outside the scope of the prophecies I used in my case today. But do you think that could be done if I bring in certain prophecies that say, and this Messiah needs to be known historically about? He can't just be anonymous, or
only if they were in such a way that couldn't ever happen in the future. Because again, this has to be you're saying that this is Jesus not just now but for all time. Like it's Jesus or bust. It means Jesus or bust forever. But
before
we move on, though, I do have a super chat, but I don't think I can put it up because I think
sure.
Yeah.
There's no comment on it.
Yeah. So I think it's supposed to be David Haxor, if I'm reading my leet speak right, gives 10 beaver bucks with no chat. Thank you so much for the super chat. If you do have a question or something, just tag me in the chat and I'll make sure to hit it. But thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and by the way, the audience is free. So if when I'm looking at my slides, if you see questions or comments that you want me to bring up, just let me know and I'll bring them up. All right. So okay, and I fully concede that. And yeah, I think I can do that by establishing it has to be before 70 AD. And then I would also bring in other things to say, and whoever this person is, he needs to be known. But I admit the three prophecies I presented today don't do that.
Well, he needs to be known, but the knowing part could presumably happen in the future, right? So like for the light to the Gentiles thing, like maybe this, I'm trying to think of another.
So he died and rose from the dead before 70 AD, but it doesn't become known until 2050.
Right.
Okay.
And again, I'm not saying that this is in fact the case. I'm just saying that I think the burden of narrowing down to one person forever, the tools you're being given to work with, I don't think are amenable to that.
Gotcha. Yep. I will concede that is a good point that I haven't thought of before. And so I need to go back and look if I can eliminate that possibility, because the prophecies that I'm thinking to do that don't because in fact they do seem like they're almost speaking about could include the end times.
Now I will concede that nobody, like, it seems very unlikely to me that I was going to say it's very unlikely that somebody else is going to come along and kind of fulfill that stuff. But then you have splinter religions from Protestant, or I don't want to say mainstream, but, more past traditional Christianity, like Mormonism and stuff like that, that do not exactly the same thing, but kind of similar. So, I mean, I don't know. Who knows?
Let me ask this as kind of a meta question then. Like, do you think it's reasonable to just constantly go, is it reasonable to even appeal to a future unknown person who could do it when right now the situation is we have Jesus or bust? Like, why wouldn't we have already, couldn't we expect that there would have already been at least one other person that we do know about now that to rule it out? Like, why is it in the here and now we have this unique situation?
I think it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because what we have is the one that succeeded. And then, so I think if you ran history back again, it's just as likely that you don't have Christianity of Jesus, but you have something similar of somebody else, right? So to say that we have nobody else now who has fulfilled this spot I don't think it's as forceful as it sounds. It's kind of like somebody wins the lottery, and it's an extremely improbable event, right? So it must be a miracle, but of course we know it's not, because somebody was going to win the lottery. Now, granted, somebody fulfilling this exact thing isn't as certain as somebody winning the lottery, but like I can imagine plenty of other universes where it's like, how is there nobody else beside our Lord and Savior Matthew? Why did nobody else fulfill these prophecies? They just don't seem to be of such a nature that no other person could have been claimed to fulfill them. Now, and that's particularly true because because it's only claimed, right? Because the resurrection is merely a claim in this argument. I mean, I'd say that if Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, that'd be pretty darn compelling evidence to me. But then of course, if you're going to use that, that brings in a whole lot of baggage, which you're avoiding by not having that as part of your argument.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Cool. So, I do have one thing I was going to want to ask you, but before I do, I think we've covered the two of the prophecies. Is there anything about Isaiah 53 that you wanted to say? Because I know in your video you did go for the nation of Israel as an equally probable interpretation. Have I refuted that to your mind, or?
It seems like, I don't want to repeat myself. It seems kind of beside the point, because I think somebody else in a different set of circumstances could just as easily reject the Isaiah as a prophecy on the basis of it referring to Israel. And also, if the prophecy is that someone is going to suffer and die and then rise from the dead, sadly, people have been suffering and dying, perhaps not rising from the dead, but suffering and dying with a fair amount of regularity since the beginning of time. So if your prophecy is that somebody's going to get the crap beat out of them and die as a result, well,
yeah, well, it is a little bit more than that, but I take your point, but I would say just remember where is it? Yeah, so like he was led like a lamb to the slaughter, so it means he was executed judiciously, and he didn't defend himself legally. Um, so like that has to happen. Obviously, cut off from the land of the living. Yes, I take your point. He also made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich in his death. That's something that's pretty specific kind of thing. The other stuff is just he died. And then obviously the resurrection is unique. It's a kind of a unique claim. So there's a little bit more, even to the death claim. Like there is a little bit more specificity in there, I would say.
I mean, I'd happily concede if Jesus rose from the dead, then you've got a pretty strong case. Of course, it's big if true. Well, I think pointing at that prophecy, though, gets back to what I was saying of people writing the Gospels we have with the prophecies in hand, which I understand for your case, it's sufficient that they make the claim, right? That's all you need. But for
it's an unfalsified claim, because if you have a falsified claim, who cares? It's been false,
but it's also kind of unfalsifiable. Like it's impossible in any practical sense to falsify, because if Jesus didn't get thrown in a grave of the rich, with Jared Joseph Arimathea, there's absolutely no way we could ever find that out.
So I would sorry, are you finished your point? I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah.
So I would disagree with that. I mean, now the facts are that you can't falsify it, because I think it's actually true. But I mean, it would be easy to falsify this. Bart Ehrman thinks he can falsify this. He doesn't believe the empty tomb story is historical, and he thinks he has good historical reasons. So there are ways to falsify these claims, right? If Jesus mythicism. Okay, if Jesus didn't exist, then he didn't die. So, or if you think there's evidence for a swoon theory. So, yeah, my point is there. Go ahead.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No. My point is that there are plausible ways to falsify these claims.
I guess. Well, when I was thinking falsified, I guess I was thinking more definitively. You could certainly argue that it's improbable. I personally agree with Ehrman, but what I mean is there's no way you could, if you found a tomb that was supposed to be Jesus's and didn't have Jesus in there, or did have Jesus in there. It's not like we have Jesus DNA. He wouldn't be in there because he was resurrected allegedly, right? So if you went and found a tomb, this is Jesus of Nazareth and there's a body, there's no way to tell this is actually Jesus' body, because there's just no way to tell, So that's the kind of thing I mean by unfalsifiable. But you could make other arguments to argue it's probably not true.
Yeah, and that would be sufficient to, again, all things considered, obviously just taking one thing in isolation, but to defeat my argument, you just need to establish that it's falsified on a balance of probabilities. I don't care about absolute certainty. That's not a requirement for truth. Okay. So if you could go ahead.
So when you said falsified, what you meant was unlikely to be true.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, again, you need to look at all things considered and stuff, because if there's a 51% probability that, let's say, the evidence that you're convinced that Jesus wasn't buried in a tomb at all, so that isn't a historical fact. Obviously, we can argue and stuff like that, but it wouldn't be game over for my argument just based on that, because there's a 49% possibility that you're wrong. So that's where you would need to put all the evidence for every aspect together and to find out what overall is more probably true. I don't know how I would go about putting all those aspects together to make that
But
decision. But
so one of the features of prophecy is supposed to be like when you were describing prophecy originally, so it has to be done in advance. It needs to be extraordinary that it would be fulfilled, right?
Mhm.
And even just looking at that burial thing, you can imagine a whole variety of other ways in which he could fulfill that prophecy that to me seemed just as reasonable. So he was buried with the wicked, but in the rich. And I think that the fulfillment of that is that he was sorry executed with the wicked, but rich in death.
Yeah,
So the fulfillment is that he was executed with the like criminals, but then he was buried in the tomb of a rich man, right?
yeah,
But I mean, he was. Imagine that it is a historical fact that he was in fact thrown in a common grave, as was often the case with crucified victims of Rome. Uh, he made his grave with the wicked. Well, he was thrown into a common like that's where the wicked are, and he's rich in his death. Well, he's rich at the hands of our Father in heaven. He has spiritual riches. Like it seems to me that's just as reasonable an interpretation of the prophecy. And because you can do these things for every prophecy in series, it I feel I've made this point a dozen times. I don't like it's not.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you also had to make the claim that you're dying for the purpose of being an offering for sin, right? The sins of Israel and the sins of the world.
Yes, but because we're allowing the claims of his future followers to take that role, it could just as easily his future followers could easily make that claim. Like like the person who's being thrown in the grave never needs to have uttered those words as long as his followers say that was the purpose, and there's no way to tell.
Yeah, I think, yeah, for my argument, it doesn't matter. Although in this case, I do think we can prove historically the historical Jesus actually did make that claim. But you're right. It doesn't matter. Even if we had no evidence establishing that, it wouldn't matter kind of thing. But yeah, I take your point. I do think that the resurrection is the real kicker that I think is providing the extraordinary aspect. So it's kind of the conjunction of you would make this new covenant, you would die and rise from the dead before 70 AD. It's really the resurrection that's doing the heavy lifting of making that conjunction of an extraordinary quality. So yeah, is that without that? Okay, he died, and I kind of take your point about what you're saying about this aspect. Although there is an element of specificity there that's important. You know, an offering, making an atonement for sin is an extraordinary aspect as well. I would argue.
It's
But
extraordinary, but like it's also it's not something you can measure or confirm. Like it's a very spiritual thing, right? And so was Jesus' death the atonement for sins? I mean, it was claimed. Was it actually? I mean, how would I possibly know that short of dying and asking God?
gotcha. Okay, cool. So yeah, I think that's it on Isaiah 53. But but you do the last thing I wanted to confirm, but you do take my point that it's not whatever this prophecy is about. I don't know if you're conceding that it is a messianic prophecy at this point, but do you at least kind of say that it's obviously not about the nation of Israel? This is something that medieval, up to date, modern day Jews are just saying, just as purely a reaction against Christians. Whatever this prophecy is, it's not about the nation of Israel. How can the suffering servant die for the nation of Israel if it is the nation of Israel?
I don't consider myself well versed enough in the reading in the way that Jewish people read their text to say that it is clearly this, that, or the other. I'm not an expert in ancient Hebrew, but for the purposes of today, let's say it's a messianic prophecy. It's fine. It doesn't matter. Like I don't think it. I don't think it ultimately matters one way or the other, because if it weren't a messianic prophecy, or if you determined it weren't, like then okay, then Jesus doesn't need to fulfill it, and we'll just pick another one from the pile. You know.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Cool. And just I'll play the skeptic for half a second if you don't mind, just for the audience sake, so they're aware. I think a much better interpretation is to go with the righteous remnant within Israel interpretation. So it's there's always this righteous remnant that their blood dies, like the Maccabees, right? Their shedding of their blood atones for the sins of the right of Israel as whole, right? Or Daniel the prophet. He's part of the righteous remnant within the corrupt, sinful nation of Israel. I would just say that's a much better interpretation. I still think that fails, and I give my three reasons here. But I just, out of fairness, I just wanted to say that there are other interpretations that you could go for that avoid saying that this is a messianic prophecy. But in the end, I think those fails. But that's all I'll say on that, since you're kind enough to concede in this debate. But all right, cool. So the one thing I wanted to ask you, and let me bring it up. So here's something that I was interested in, and I'm hoping maybe you can do it, right? So strategy number 5. So this is where, pretend you concede I was successful in everything I said. We do have Jesus or bust, and with provable, objective elements and prophecies that cumulatively are extraordinary, and we have unfalsified claims of Jesus, and you're like, wow, yeah, that it's clear nobody else can fulfill this. It's Jesus or bust in terms of the Jewish Messiah. But what about another way of falsifying it is to say, look, forget about the Jewish prophecies, or forget about, there are other religions that have prophecies like Hinduism, Buddhism, or in this case, I made it about Islam, right? Because Islam claims to use the Bible and say that there are prophecies about Muhammad. And I went through that in my presentation and just showed the prophecies about Muhammad, like Deuteronomy 18 saying, oh, there will be a prophet like Moses. Okay, I mean, that could be anybody. In fact, we have so many different people and options there. Like, for example, it's actually talking about Joshua. And I would argue that Muhammad is actually falsified because this prophet has to be Jewish. He comes from among Moses's actual brethren, the nation of Israel, and stuff like that. So, but this is what the point is. Muslims make an attempt to say, well, we can establish, given biblical prophecies, that we have Muhammad or bust with certain prophecies. And that's what I wanted to raise to you. Can you think of any examples in any religion or anywhere, Nostradamus or anything, whereby we have a similar situation, a set of extraordinary prophecies that are clear enough, and whereby we have someone or something that makes unfalsified claims to fulfill those, where it's comparable? It's that person or thing or bust for fulfilling that. Is there anything comparable that you know of?
I have to admit my knowledge of other religions, particularly non-Western religions, is pretty thin. I know the basic tenets and some of their ideas, and that is about the end of it. So I would not be a good person to ask. Like, do I know of one? No, but that doesn't tell you basically anything, because even if there was one, I wouldn't know about it. I just haven't studied them deeply. I will say that it wouldn't surprise me much either way, because, like, on the one hand, not every religion, in the West, it often feels like the features of religion include having a text with all these like prophecies and all but that's just that's a Jewish thing that ended up becoming a Western thing through Christianity and to some extent Islam. That's not how every religion even functions. So we wouldn't necessarily expect other religions to have this, because that's kind of like asking, why aren't other religions more like mine? Well, because they're not yours,
Fair enough. And that, from my experience with other religions and their texts, that is the case. Like, this isn't really a thing, right? Like, that they'll have like scattered prophecies about random things or something like that every once in a while in some texts. Like, for example, I'm thinking about like one person brought up like Native Americans or something, right? They prophesied that there would be these people with pale skin that would come, and stuff. That's it. That's all they've got. That's their prophecy. And the Spanish conquistadors came, and see, that's a fulfillment of the prophecy. But it's so unimpressive because, number one, it's a one-off. Number two, the prophecy was written after the Spanish conquistadors happened. And even if it wasn't, you could appeal to something like maybe someone saw the Vikings, and that spread. So they saw white people or something like that. But even still, like the point is, it's just not comparable. It's not like, oh, we have a set of prophecies about this same subject, and they're cumulatively making this case. That's just not what they're about. These other religions that I've seen. So yeah, I take your point. All right, that's. I think that's it. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about, or?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. I think that the approach is interesting because it sacrifices like ultimate power, like the traditional argument from prophecy, if successful, would get somebody all the way to belief, right?
Yeah.
So this takes a strategy of sacrificing some of that ultimate power of the argument to make it much more achievable, which is a valid way to go about arguing. A lot of people seem to have this idea that if an argument doesn't get you 100% of the way, it's useless, which is just not the case. Like if I make an argument, even if you're not convinced that I'm right at the end, if you're more convinced than you were when we started, then that means it had value and was effective in, to some degree at least, right? And so, like in that sense, I think it's a clever approach, and so it's far more likely to succeed than the other one. I expect,
Mm-hmm.
but I just it's the part where it has to be uniquely Jesus forever that trips me up.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Yeah, I'm trying to scan the audience because I wasn't able to check it. Did you notice any comments or questions that?
I have been watching and engaging with my audience. Your audience mostly consists of Wesley Curry 2 yelling prophecies at us. But my audience, I think I've answered all their questions. If anybody has one, rapidly, please tag me. But yeah. There was one question that one of your audience asked that I did answer in the chat, but might be interesting for people to hear.
Mhm.
The Ugly Truth asked, and I assume he's speaking to me because he says, hypothetically speaking, if you die, come to find out that Jesus, God, and divinity was real, and you wasted 80 years of your life. Man, I hope I live at least that long. Disbelieving it, what would you do? Especially since I was a Christian for the first like 20 years. That means I made it to like 100. And my answer to that was, okay, and we have a super chat that I'll get to in a second. My answer to that was, I don't think I would have wasted my life. I feel like pursuing the truth is a value in and of itself, and asking these sort of questions, like the unexamined life is not worth living, and I feel like I'm examining my life. And so I think the process of skepticism and trying the struggle to get closer to truth has value. And so if I got to the end and I stand in front of God and I'm wrong, I was wrong, like, okay, well, fair enough, I'm gonna be wrong about some stuff, I wouldn't see that as a waste personally.
Gotcha. Yeah, I see the super chat from. So I think this one's for me. So how can you establish Jesus fulfilled any prophecies when the Gospels were written a generation after the crucifixion and show signs of legendary development? So in the first place, so I would just say, like, with the argument that I was going over, you're totally missing the point. I don't care about proving Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. I'm not making an argument from directly fulfilled prophecies. I'm making a circumstantial argument based on Jesus's unfalsified claims, or the New Testament's claims about Jesus to have fulfilled these prophecies. So there's a slight difference there where I wouldn't do that, right? And to illustrate the difference, so look, how do we, obviously you're familiar, I'm assuming, with Christian apologists and historians who apply the criteria of authenticity to the Gospels as sources and then argue for certain historical facts. So with Isaiah 53, if I were to make an argument from direct fulfilled prophecy, I think Isaiah 53 is my best shot, because I do think I can prove historically that Jesus died, and that he claimed his death was for our sins. I can't, and that he resurrected from the dead. So I could make that argument from fulfilled prophecy. But there are certain elements to Isaiah 53, like, for example, the theological claim that he died for our sins. How I can't prove that, well, Jesus fulfilled that. Like, I can prove historically he died and that he resurrected, me and Jordan would debate that. But I can't prove historically that, oh, and he died for our sins. And this is where I think, a direct fulfillment of prophecy kind of thing argument doesn't work as well when you're looking at messianic prophecies. Now, it could be argued, look, I would make an argument from, what do I call it? It's the vindication prediction argument, right? So this is kind of, I say that Jesus predicted before his death, and I can prove this historically. Mike Licona has published a peer-reviewed journal with a total of 6 arguments based on the criteria of authenticity that Jesus predicted, like Isaiah 53, that he would die and rise from the dead. And I think I can prove, because we can prove the fulfillment of that, that would be one thing where I would submit, I can prove directly an argument from fulfilled prophecy. And I call that the vindication prediction argument. But with messianic prophecies, if I'm looking at Isaiah 53 instead, that I can't prove every aspect of that prophecy, such as theological things like he died for our sins and stuff like that. So that's why I prefer to use my nuanced approach with messianic prophecies. I hope that answered the question. But yeah, that makes sense.
David, tag me if it didn't, and I'll ask clarifying questions. So that did bring up one thing, though, as you were describing that about the claims. So this is about claims from the past. I think that weakens the uniquely Jesus thing a little bit, because some of the features, like it's a virgin birth, or like the place of his birth, Bethlehem, or stuff like that, right? That narrow it down to just Jesus. We can't. We are getting these as claims from people after the fact who are writing, and could at least potentially be writing to make their guy fit the claims, right? And so if the person doesn't actually have to fit the he didn't have to actually be born in Bethlehem. He has to merely be claimed to have been born in Bethlehem, and he doesn't actually have to have been born from a virgin. He immediately has to claim to be born a virgin. That makes it a lot easier for a future person to make those claims. Now, I understand you would cut off the future part because you think that it has to be before 70, right?
Mm-hmm.
But suppose that it was successfully argued that that is not rock solid, if you can leave that aside, then it seems like if you're allowing for just the mere claim, and it doesn't have to necessarily be shown to be backed up by reality, just for this argument, then that's going to make it a lot easier for a hypothetical future person who isn't Jesus to make that claim.
Yeah, and I'll just say, so I agree with and disagree with that point. So here's where I agree that it is a lot easier, because I'm just saying, look, I don't even care about Jesus' claims himself. I'm open to any and all authoritative. I should have said this. So that's why, for me, it's just New Testament, right? I don't care about the church fathers and stuff like that. But if you could, hypothetically, if you could prove the church fathers are authoritative, inspired sources, I will include them too. But for the record, my thing is about the authoritative, unfalsified claims. And for me, that's just the New Testament. That's what I believe is authoritative. And that makes it easier, right? I mean, yeah, they're looking, and in some cases, with Matthew especially, they are directly looking for messianic prophecies in the Bible and putting that in there. That, I think, is proven historically that they were doing that. That doesn't mean they were fudging anything or talking about false things, but they were purposefully looking for messianic prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. But I think that's irrelevant, because, yeah, it makes it a lot easier to find prophecies for Jesus fulfilled. But I still come back to, but we still have this unique situation of Jesus or bust. If it's so easy, I mean, Jesus wasn't the only Jewish Messiah claimant who had followers. Why didn't Jared McComb's followers in 100 BC do the same thing? Why didn't they go to the Old Testament and, oh, Jared did this, he did this and that and that? That's my response to that. The second thing where I disagree with you, Jordan, is that based on allowing the followers to do this after the fact, and because it's not just one, but we have multiple people doing it independently, it also makes it harder in some ways to fulfill, because the potential for contradictions is higher, right? If we have claims that contradict, like, oh, Jesus was born in Bethlehem and Jesus was not born in Bethlehem, well, that equals a falsification, because the law of contradiction would be violated. And you could say, well, look, we have falsified claim. Either way you look at it, we have a falsified claim. that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy or something like that. So the potential for contradictions makes it harder in some ways.
I don't know that that would manifest in reality because of the way that religious traditions tend to grow. So what would happen in that case, and it's always possible, we know that there was more writings of Christianity than we have. And so if you had a claim like Jesus was born in Bethlehem and this fulfills the prophecy, and another one's like Jesus was not born in Bethlehem and did not fulfill the prophecy, both of those are not going to survive. One, the sect that believes one is ultimately going to triumph over the sect that believes the other, and that's the one that's going to be preserved through history and seen to be the orthodoxy. And so like having multiple followers, like multiple Christians did have many ideas, and a lot of them were just proclaimed to be heresy, and heresy means, your belief, not mine, right? Nobody thinks they're a heretic. Everybody.
Yeah.
So
unless you're David Russell, but yeah.
Yeah, right. So like, yeah, orthodoxy is my doxy and heterodoxy is your doxy. So yeah. So I just I think if we could teleport and go back in time and take a survey of people who believe themselves to be followers of Jesus, you would have that variety of claims, but they winnow out over time.
So I will admit that is a really, really good point. And that speaks, especially because I was specified at the end that I only look at the authoritative claims, right? And obviously you get that, well, do the church fathers qualify or not? And we could get into the details. Well, how do we prove what's inspired? Why do I only believe the New Testament is inspired and not the Gospel of Thomas or the church father Irenaeus or something like that? But barring that, we even within the New Testament, within the narrow scope of what I accept, just pretend that's justified, we still have independent traditions whereby there is a potential for contradictions. And in fact, just so I'm getting this clear, Jordan, do you believe there are contradictions in the resurrection accounts in the New Testament, or do you deny that there are contradictions there?
I think that there are contradictions as written. There are ways to get around those contradictions. So, for example, well, you said specifically the resurrection account. The timeline of John is different than the timeline of the synoptics. Right. Jesus appears to have been crucified on a different day, and it appears at least plausible that John made this change from the synoptics to make a theological point that Jesus was the Lamb of God, and so that's like the point he's making. So I think that there are contradictions if you interpret them literally. However, I think that if you could sit down, whoever the author or authors of John were, and whoever the author and authors of the synoptics were, and said, "Hey, John, how come you changed the thing? Why did you write down something that's wrong?" John would say, "What do you mean? No, like it's not literally true. That's not the point. You're missing the point. I'm telling you the truth. The truth is that Jesus is the Lamb of God. That's the point. You're missing the point." So like I think that there are contradictions, but I don't think that means. I think that's just missing what the author was getting at, probably. And also like. What I think that means is that you can't say that these are like divinely inspired in the sense that every single word is true. And if you read in the Bible, that means it actually happened in history, because like I think it could still contain truth and not be like that. Like there's more than one way to be true.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I don't think that there is contradictions, or I think that the vast majority of them can be harmonized or explained in different ways, such as the ways you go. But the point is that I was making with those differences, regardless of whether you think they actually contradict or not, it does show this is one part of the reasons biblical scholars, including Bart Ehrman and skeptics and stuff, will say that there is independent traditions going on there. And as long as you have two or more independent traditions, that does allow for the potential for contradictions that could have come up and therefore falsified this, right? So it's just saying, yeah, there's pros and cons if you allow that.
I was raised fundamentalist, and so like in my tradition growing up, if you had allowed anything to be, if there was a contradiction that was an actual, one person said one thing and one person said another, that means the whole Bible is false and Christianity is dead. Like that was the idea that I was given. I don't think that's a very wise way to either read the text. I don't think it's what the original authors probably intended. I don't think that's like you're missing a lot of meaning, and I don't think it's reasonable. Like, so in the chat, people are talking about like who found the empty tomb, were there guards or were there not? Did Jesus ride into Bethlehem in one animal or two? And I think that like written literally, these can be you can find harmonizations. That doesn't mean there's not a contradiction. It means a contradiction is explicable.
Mm-hmm.
But like I think that tells you that the book is not 100% an accurate depiction of history as it existed. But that doesn't mean in and of itself that the general thing it's writing about is not true. So like that is a defeater for the very fundamentalist black and white rigid interpretation, but that is not the only interpretation. And while it seems to be the most popular in certain circles of the internet, I do not think that is the most popular even among Christians.
Yeah. Like I said, for me, I'm good either way. I think a lot of them can be harmonized, even taking them literally. But there may be certain things where you apply Mike Lacona's approach with ancient literary devices, and those don't technically count as contradictions. They're differences with an explanation and stuff like that. But again, that isn't my point. I'm kind of just saying for my argument, what I was just saying there is pretend they are contradictions, like the intention they just screwed up and got it wrong. That would count as a falsify of a messianic prophecy, right? So let's say the Gospel of John said, for the sake of argument, said Jesus rose from the dead as per Isaiah 53, but Gospel of Mark said that he didn't rise from the dead and he swooned on the cross or something like that. That would, I think, count against, at least on a balance of probabilities, my hypothesis, because then you would say, well, which one is historically accurate? And, Gospel of Mark's earlier than John, and you'd have to get into those debates and stuff. And if you could prove Mark is historically accurate, that would falsify it. Isaiah 53 says he's going to rise from the dead, and we know historically that he probably didn't rise from the dead. So there's more opportunities for falsification. That's my only point. And then I'll shut up. Makes sense?
Yeah.
All right. Cool. I think that's it. Pretty good answer, he's saying. Awesome. So, yeah, I hope that's it. Felix Fortuna saying, why would God need to open the tomb to get Jesus out of it?
So I don't think, well, first of all, through God, all things are possible, right? He doesn't have to. But like, I think those are kind of missing the point of the narrative. Like, I don't know. I don't find those kind of lines of argument particularly persuasive for myself because, like, I don't know. Like, God could have done anything. The fact that he chose this one thing versus another, that's not an argument I would make personally.
Gotcha. Yeah, same here. I don't think this is obviously he's trying to say, well, Jesus, look, he can walk through walls. He didn't need to open the tomb. He could have walked right through it. And that's true. Or as Bob Rucker says, gone to another dimension and then reappeared in 3 dimensions, right? But that's true. But don't forget, God isn't just concerned with getting Jesus out of the tomb. He's also wanting the disciples and the women to come running the next day, see that it's open and look into the tomb. So that needed the tomb to be open for them to look in and see the burial clothes. So, there could be any number of reasons.
I think you can make an argument about other things that God doesn't do, but that would be a whole other topic of discussion. So
fair enough. We've had that, right? Like, why would God make the shroud date to the medieval period if the carbon dating is correct, which it isn't, folks. But all right, cool. So thank you so much for coming on it. And it's about 2 hours, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I thought it was great getting your feedback, substantive criticisms to this argument, because it's not something I've fully developed. It's not one of the reasons I'm a Christian, but it's something where I think there's potential. If somebody did the legwork and developed it further, maybe it could go somewhere. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed your time.
Yeah, always fun.
Awesome. All right, take care, everyone, and I will see everybody in 1 hour, because I am having the famous atheist from infidels.org, Keith Augustine, on my show to talk about near-death experiences, and he'll be giving the skeptical case against veridical NDEs as proof for the afterlife. So see you in an hour.